So in the lead up to the 2008 presidential primaries, a conservative corporation called Citizens United sought to air a documentary that they had produced about Hillary Clinton. Hillary the movie featured interviews with conservative pundits and politicians, and the film was largely related to scandals that the Clintons, and specifically Hillary Clinton, were allegedly involved in, like Travelgate. Travelgate was related to the alleged firing of Clinton White House travel office staff and the replacement of those staff with friends and family members of the Clintons. Whitewater, which was related to real estate investments. Filegate, which was related to access to FBI security clearance documents. And Cattle Futures Gate. This is what I imagine a cattle future would look like. And this was related to Clinton allegedly receiving insider information about cattle trading. So because the corporation's documentary was viewed as an electioneering communication or a political campaign activity that was designed to be broadcast to over 50,000 people, it was illegal to promote it or air it really close to an election. And this was due to the federal campaign finance laws that we had on the books at the time. So it ended up being banned from distribution. So Citizens United wanted to put this documentary out onto the airwaves, and it was banned because it was thought of as illegal under our campaign finance laws at the time. So naturally, Citizens United sued. And they argued that the prohibition on this communication was a violation of their free speech rights under the First Amendment. So the long story short about the Citizens United court battle is that the Supreme Court ended up siding with Citizens United on a 5-4 ideological split. And the Supreme Court then says that the law that restricts unions and corporations from independent political spending and prohibiting the communications of things like Hillary the movie was unconstitutional. And while this case was decided in 2010, and thus the airing of the documentary was not going to have an effect on the 2008 election cycle, the Citizens United decision fundamentally changed the way that money works in American campaigns and elections. And this case remains a hotly debated Supreme Court case, particularly along partisan lines amongst partisan elites. So how has Citizens United changed American elections, and why should you care? So first, I want to situate Citizens United within the broader logic of Supreme Court campaign finance decisions. And then I'll talk about what Citizens United has changed about how elections work and why I think those changes matter for how we think about corruption, transparency, and money in elections. So based on previous Supreme Court rulings, the decision in Citizens United wasn't totally unexpected. For many decades, the Supreme Court has viewed campaign spending as a form of speech that's protected by the First Amendment. But the Supreme Court has also decided that restrictions on spending are important. The government also has an interest in preventing the corrupting influence of money on politicians. So what the court's trying to do here is balance two competing principles. We obviously value free speech in this country, but we only value it as far as it allows our politicians to remain scrupulous. So while we wouldn't want to restrict one candidate's speech or restrict the marketplace of ideas, we also wouldn't want to allow any single donor's money to make up a majority of a candidate's campaign budget. So this is why Citizens United could be viewed as consistent with how the Supreme Court has previously ruled on campaign finance cases. If we don't give the money to the politician, but instead spend the money on that politician's behalf independently of that politician, we eliminate the danger of corruption while also protecting the candidate's right to speak. And Kennedy says as much in writing for the majority. He says, independent expenditures do not give rise to corruption or to the appearance of corruption. But the dissenters in this case are like, what? this doesn't make any sense to us. So led by Justice Stevens, I really appreciate in this portrait, he's kind of got this like skeptical face going on already, which is really nice. Stevens and the other dissenters are wondering, can spending by independent groups like Citizens United also be corrupting? Would it be problematic if an issue or a politician that has one or two wealthy donors could drown out perspectives or politicians that don't have any wealthy donors at all? So Citizens United paved the way for social welfare groups, which are also known as 501c4s, to spend directly from their general funds on campaign advocacy and issue ads. This means while these groups have to file with the Federal Election Commission when they make political expenditures, they have no obligation to tell the FEC where that money came from. And there are a lot of 501c4s, as you see from this blurry image, and not all of them are political. But a couple of them might sound familiar to you, like AARP and the National Rifle Association. So when groups like these use a source of money for a political purpose, and the source of that money is unknown or untraceable, it is known in campaign finance as dark money. And in 2016, an estimated $181 million was spent on supporting candidates and issues with no known donor attached. And in 2012, dark money accounted for about $308 million of campaign spending. Now, both Democratic and Republican candidates and issues are supported by this kind of funding, but Republican causes tend to get the lion's share of support from this kind of spending. So according to the Center for Responsive Politics, the rate is about $8 for every Republican candidate or issue to $1 for every Democratic issue or candidate. And not only does dark money play a supporting role in elevating candidates and issues that these groups choose to support, it's also played a starring role in some of our recent elections. Take, for example, the 2016 presidential election. Campaign finance was a talking point for both Democratic and Republican candidates. Democratic candidates Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders both suggested that they would only appoint justices to the Supreme Court who would reverse Citizens United. So these two quotes that you see here come from a February 2016 primary debate, and they're both pretty explicit about this, right? They're saying Citizens United is bad law, and if I become president, what I am going to do is ensure that this is overturned by the Supreme Court. On the other hand, Marco Rubio went on the record as an advocate for the opposite position, saying that spending money on campaigns is a form of political speech that is protected by the Constitution. So what he's arguably suggesting here is that any limitation on spending is also an unconstitutional limitation on political speech. Here's something a little bit more recent. So dark money was also a major talking point of the Kavanaugh confirmation battle. So in recent years, independent groups have spent quite a bit of money to advocate for their chosen Supreme Court nominee. One reason why they might do this is to try to appeal to members of the Senate who are on the fence about voting for that confirmation. But they might also be trying to target the public, because you want to empower the public to put pressure on their respective senators. So it's hard to say what the total spent on advertising for Kavanaugh was, as some of these filings have not been reported to the FEC yet. But the estimates from the Brennan Center for Justice suggest that almost $7 million of dark money was used to buy television ads in support of Kavanaugh, and about $3 million was used to buy television ads that were against Kavanaugh. So I want to show you a couple of examples of these advertisements, because I don't think that in Illinois we often have an opportunity to see Supreme Court campaign ads, if you will. So the first video I'm going to show you is a 30-second ad from the Judicial Crisis Network. And the Judicial Crisis Network was one of the main advocates of Kavanaugh's confirmation. This ad is coming from the state of North Dakota, and the ad is trying to appeal to Heidi Heitkamp's constituents.
President Trump has nominated another great judge for the Supreme Court, Brett Kavanaugh. He treats everyone fairly and has a record of applying the Constitution just as it was written. So Heidi Heitkamp has a decision to make. Does she support Kavanaugh and prove she's on the side of the president and you? Or does she side with the radical liberals in Washington, D.C.? Tell Heidi Heitkamp her decision on Kavanaugh is something you won't forget.
That took quite a turn, right? So the second ad that I want to show you is from Demand Justice, and it's an anti-Kavanaugh ad, but I think it takes an interesting look at why Heidi Heitkamp's supporters should not support Kavanaugh.
Meet Brett Kavanaugh, son of a Washington lobbyist. As a judge, ruled for special interests. Lives the high life in Washington. No wonder conservatives are upset.
A lot of the folks in the base really were sort of turned off to Brett Kavanaugh. He is from Washington. He is the establishing pick.
I've got problems with Kavanaugh in general. He's kind of the D.C. insider pick.
This person is at the heart and soul of the D.C. establishment.
Are you saying it's a swamp pick?
Yes.
These Republicans have it right. Tell Senator Heitkamp, oppose Kavanaugh for Supreme Court.
So I hope it'll stick here for a second. So just like on the last ad, it'll tell you the name of the group, but the name of the group doesn't really give you a lot of information about who actually is behind this ad. Also this year, Beto O'Rourke has come out against dark money, and he's also made turning down PAC and corporate money a really big part of his campaign. However, there are some independent groups like the Super PAC, the Democratic Coalition, that are still speaking out in favor of Beto's candidacy. So even though Beto is saying, I resist and I reject the influence of these kinds of organizations in campaigns, the head of the Democratic Coalition, Scott Dworkin, said, campaigns can say whatever they want, that's fine, but I mean, we get involved with whatever we want, right? And this message is precisely indicating the struggle that we see between candidates and independent spending, right? This group is saying, we can spend money on this campaign if we want, and it has nothing to do with what the candidate wants us to do. So why should we care about this kind of spending in politics? Advocates of campaign finance reform argue that voters should know who is funding political ads. Such information is likely useful for voters. It helps them evaluate political messages and understand which groups or people might be trying to influence politicians. And without this information, voters might not have all the tools needed to make an informed choice and might end up supporting a candidate who does not share their values or interests. And further, there's some evidence across a number of public opinion polls that Americans of both parties fundamentally reject the regime of unrestricted money in elections that was made possible by the Citizens United decision and other related court cases. So a number of polls have shown that Americans across both parties, that's important, both parties, favor an overhaul of how political campaigns are financed. So this suggests that even though we see a polarized view amongst political elite on the issue of campaign finance, the American public doesn't mirror that polarization and is more united around the position of reform. So on that idea that maybe there are some reform issues that are coming up, there are a couple of reforms that I want to tell you about. So a first reform idea is the Disclose Act. And this has been introduced in Congress a couple of times since Citizens United, and is supported by Democrats in both chambers. So a major provision of the Disclose Act would require that all groups that spend over $10,000 on elections should provide their names to the FEC. There's also been action in 19 states to amend the US Constitution in response to Citizens United, with some states passing citizen-led ballot propositions or bills in favor of a constitutional convention for passing campaign finance reform. And finally, Seattle has this neat program called democracy vouchers. In 2015, Seattle voters passed a citizen-initiated proposal called Honest Elections Seattle. So for a modest increase in your property taxes, it's like $10 per homeowner, citizens of Seattle can get $100 in vouchers to publicly fund City of Seattle elections, which increases public involvement in the financing of local campaigns. So over $800 million in dark money has been spent by independent groups since the Citizens United decision. And I'm just wondering, is this problematic for our democracy? As I know you're all going to go to the polls in November, I want to make sure that you are making informed choices, even if the campaign finance laws on the books make it more difficult. And I want you to ask your elected officials where they stand on this. If they support dark money, ask them why they choose to keep this source of their support obscured. Thank you.